In June 1940, an armistice was signed right here between Germany and France, and it ended the German invasion of France that kicked off in May that year. And did you know that on this very place in 1918 the armistice of the First World War was signed? In this video we're going to talk about the German invasion of France. What operations did take place and why were the French so ineffective against the German onslaught? Keep watching.
Good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, my name is Stefan, I'm a Dutch history teacher and I love to cover history on location and at home. This subject I really wanted to cover for a long time. If you find this interesting, consider subscribing, and if you want to support me, you can do so via Patreon, PayPal, a super thanks, or you can buy me a coffee. You can all find the links below. When discussing the Battle of France 1940, we must notice that it was not only a battle of Germany versus France. No, the invasion of France occurred simultaneously with the invasions of the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, and British forces were active in Western Europe to halt the German onslaught that began on the 10th of May 1940. The invasion and subsequent German victory has led to many myths, memes and oversimplifications. All French are cowards, or the Germans won because they were on drugs, or just superior. Do notice that the German victory over France did not come easy. It was a mixture of both planning and improvisation. Were the Germans that good? Were the Allies that bad? Let's discuss. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, tensions in Europe rose. Now, France and Britain were not eager to wage war on Germany again. Yes, they did win in 1918, the end of the First World War, but victory came at a cost, as millions of men had died on the battlefield. Unlike the First World War, there was no war enthusiasm when the Second World War broke out. In 1938, Hitler was granted the Sudeten area, and the following year he annexed the remaining Czech lands, as Slovakia became a Nazi puppet state. The Allies pledged that if Germany dared to attack Poland, they would declare war on them. Hitler did invade Poland, which happened on September 1st, and as a result, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Neither Britain nor France were prepared for war, not on a material level, not on a mental level. Let's take a look at the French army of that time. It was pretty much an army of the First World War. In appearance, the French 1939 uniform was almost identical to that of 1918, except for the color, but also in tactics. The French heavily relied on defense tactics and decentralization of armored vehicles over the infantry units. Iconic was the construction of the Maginot Line, a line on concrete fortifications built in the 1930s to deter a future German invasion. Compared to 1918, the French did have newer tanks, such as the Char 1 bis tank. On the 26th of August 1939, the French army mobilized under French Chief of Army Staff Maurice Gamelin. When war broke out, the French did an abortive attempt to attack Germany. This was known as the Saar Offensive, but they quickly pulled back. I did cover this operation in another video. From that moment till May 1940, historians speak about the phony war. It was a moment that the French and their allies, the British, were stationed in France at the border to wait for a possible attack. It left the world in a state of tense anticipation. The French, like I said, had adopted a defensive strategy and relied on the Maginot Line. And the Allies believed that if they could hold their defensive positions, the economic blockade and attrition would do the rest and weaken Germany. Pretty much what happened in World War I. Now, unlike World War I, this time the Allies had no joint command. For many months, despite the declaration of war, Europe experienced a bizarre calm. On the 9th of April 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, hostilities began again. The British and the French did send troops to Norway, but these were poorly prepared and ultimately would be defeated. In general, there was a lack of support for the war in France. And the Germans, they exploited this sentiment by spreading propaganda that it were the British who had dragged the French into this war. And when push would come to shove, it would be the French that had to perform the bulk of the fighting. The defensive mentality of the French affected its military organization. Most of the tank units, they were not well trained. They had 3 mechanized divisions and a 4th was hastily assembled under Colonel Charles de Gaulle. The tanks were split up among its infantry and had therefore a supportive role. The Allies lacked effective anti-tank guns and their radio communications were primitive. And when we look about the Air Force, well, the French Air Force was in a lamentable state. The French hoped that the British RAF would make up for it. But British Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding was not keen on deploying British aircraft to France. German General Erich von Manstein drafted a plan for the attack on France, which was a reversal of the Schlieffen Plan. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, had launched an effective disinformation campaign. Manstein believed that once the attack would begin, the Allies would send the bulk of their forces into Belgium to confront the Germans there. The French actually favored this idea because they preferred fighting on Belgian soil and therefore avoid large destruction in northern France that had occurred during the First World War. Prior to the German invasion, a German plane crash-landed in Belgium, containing documents with details of the plan. But the Allies believed it was a German plan to mislead them. In the early morning, on May 10th, 1940, the invasions of 4 countries began. The Germans invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France. Oh yeah, and also the British took Iceland that day. Now, however, this video focuses on the Battle of France, I do want to discuss the German invasions of the Low Countries. Neutral Netherlands was pretty much on its own despite Allied promises. The Dutch soldiers did fight back, inflicting losses on the Germans, but after the German bombing of Rotterdam, they capitulated officially on May 15th, with the exception of the province of Zeeland, which capitulated later. Luxembourg had no means to stop the Germans. The only thing border guards could do before surrendering to the Germans was making clear they were violating Luxembourgish neutrality. Belgium, initially allied to France, had adopted the policy of neutrality some years prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. And the events that occurred in Belgium were decisive for the outcome of the Battle of France. The German attack looked like a variant of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan by attacking France via the Low Countries. This time the Germans moved their panzers through the Belgian Ardennes. Other units moved through Belgium to attack the Germans head-on. After the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael was captured, the Belgian troops retreated to the Dyle line, stretching from Antwerp to Namur. These German attacks, they grabbed the attention of the British and French forces that quickly moved into Belgium, but they were hindered by large streams of Belgian refugees who hadn't forgotten the German atrocities of the First World War during 1914. The first large-scale tank battle took place at Hannut, where the French tanks wrought havoc on light armored German tanks. The following day, German commander Hubner managed to break through the long, thin line of French tanks. The French didn't maneuver fast enough, and because of the lack of radios on the French tanks, they pulled back. Meanwhile, on the very first day of the German invasion, German Messerschmitt aircraft managed to shoot up French aircraft lined up at dispersal. The British RAF managed to take down 30 German bombers, but after this, these became harder targets because now they were escorted by German fighter planes. That day, the French lost 56 aircraft out of 879, and the RAF lost 49 out of 384. The Luftwaffe lost over 100 planes that day, but most of these were transport planes taken down by the Dutch. But the decisive move was not going to take place in central Belgium, but further to the south. Well in the southeast, in the Ardennes, Army Group A, led by Gerd von Rundstedt, snaked with huge columns of vehicles through the forest, which hid them from Allied aircraft. The plan worked better than expected, despite some delays caused by blown up bridges and the Belgian chasseurs Ardennes, special trained troops that harassed the Germans. German news broadcasts mostly talked about the battles in the Netherlands and central Belgium, And this was a deliberate effort to distract the Allies from what was going on further south at the Dinant and Sedan sectors. French commander Gamelin refused to acknowledge this threat despite the warnings. The French city of Sedan was captured on May 12th. Yet the Germans still had to cross the river there. Charles Hunziker, commander of the French Second Army, did not think Sedan was a vulnerable place in his front because he expected the Germans to move east to attack the French Maginot Line from behind. Therefore, his best troops were located in the right flank of Sedan. And at Sedan were mostly French B reserve troops. Initially, the Germans that were trying to cross the river at Sedan were held back by French artillery, but they then called in the Stuka dive bombers who took care of that. Like I said, at Sedan, French B reserve troops were stationed. Now, as the Germans were making their bridgeheads, the French could have counterattacked and destroyed the bridgeheads, but they wavered, and as a result the Germans managed to get their panzers across. And that was not the only problem the French reservists were facing, because as dusk fell, rumors spread the Germans had already crossed large amounts of tanks, and their units would soon be cut off. As a result, panic spread among the French ranks, and communication between units began to break down as the Germans had bombed the French communication lines. The French at Sedan began to retreat. A spirit of every man for himself began to take hold. Most of these French reservists were veterans and survivors of the First World War, and they did not want to perish in this fight. And German propaganda that the British had got them into this fight influenced many. So did anti-war tracts of the French Communist Party. French commander Gamelin got overtaken by events. He ordered Hunziker's Second Army to launch a counterattack, but by the time the general had redeployed his troops, all it could do was perform some local attacks. He, French commander Hunziker, assumed that the breakthrough was intended to strike south and roll up the Maginot Line from behind. As a result, he strengthened his forces on the right when Guderian was advancing through his far weaker left. The fall of Sedan. Sedan, with all its echoes of Napoleon III's surrender in 1870, struck horror into the hearts of French commanders. The Germans had now 3 bridgeheads around Sedan, Dinant and Monthermé. The Allies did send aircraft, around 150 bombers and 250 fighters, to destroy the bridgeheads, but the targets proved to be too small to destroy. Also, German fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns took down many Allied planes. The RAF suffered 40 out of 71 bombers, and the French obsolete planes were massacred. German Panzer Commander Heinz Guderian, who commanded the troops at Sedan, was ordered to wait until sufficient reinforcements had arrived and brought across the Meuse River. Advancing towards the coast would be really risky, as his flanks would be exposed and vulnerable for an Allied counterattack. But Guderian, he sensed that the French were in chaos, and he sensed correctly. The opportunity was too good to miss. Thus, what erroneously had been described as Blitzkrieg strategy was to a large degree improvised on the ground, and thus the German spearheads raced on. The French troops they encountered were stunned and immediately surrendered. They were told to lay down their weapons and march east. The French were in disarray. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was called by his French colleague Paul Reynaud, who said to him the following: "We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle. The front is broken near Sedan. They are pouring through in great numbers with tanks and armored cars. The road to Paris is open. Send us all the planes and all the troops you can." Churchill was prepared to help the French, but Air Chief Marshal Dowding, he was not, because he feared that if the RAF would sacrifice its planes in France, they would not be able to protect the British island against a possible future German attack. Another decision was made that day. British RAF bombers would bomb the Ruhr area as a retaliation of the German bombing of Rotterdam. Churchill desperately sent a telegram to US President Roosevelt, hoping to get the United States in the war on behalf of the Allies. Roosevelt offered no commitment to intervene. On the 16th of May in the afternoon, Churchill flew to Paris to discuss the matters with his French colleagues. He found the French commander Gamelin in a state of apathy as he shrugged his shoulders hopelessly. The French now expected the British to bail them out, but the British pilots were exhausted. After days of flying, some pilots had to fly over 5 sorties a day, and the French pilots stood practically no chance. Meanwhile, reports came in of the disintegration of the French army as many soldiers began to retreat, and heaps of civilians made their way south as well. Millions of people were on the run. Meanwhile, the German spearhead made its way towards the Channel, refueling their tanks at abandoned petrol stations and from French army fuel dumps. Their own supply lines were unprotected. The French could launch an attack from the south. The German panzers were ordered to halt in order to make the infantry catch up. A French unit led by Colonel Charles de Gaulle did manage to perform a counterattack. De Gaulle favored mechanized warfare and counterattacked with an ill-assorted collection of tank battalions with little infantry support and almost no artillery. It was no success as the Germans responded with air support and the French had to withdraw. De Gaulle would perform another counterattack later, also with no success. The French did some reshuffling as Renault appoints a new cabinet, making himself Minister of Defense. World War I hero Philippe Pétain became Deputy Prime Minister and Maxime Weygand was recalled from Syria to command the French army and replace Gamelin. To what end? The British, they moved 66 planes away from France to Britain, and the French felt betrayed. They began to suspect that the British were planning an evacuation, although there were no plans up until that point. German General Erwin von Witzleben's First Army made his first breach in the Maginot Line, preventing the French to send forces to the Panzer Corridor. On May 10th, the Germans reached Amiens, and that evening they reached the Channel coast. The Allies reached the bulk of their units were now trapped, and they had to perform a counterattack in order to break out. John Gard, commander of the BEF, pointed out his men were defending the line of the Scheldt and couldn't be pulled away. He did allow 2 divisions to make a counterattack on Arras. The counterattack, although courageously carried out, did simply not have the strength or the French support, except for some cavalry units, to achieve its goal. And this convinced the British that the French had lost the will to fight. The British-French alliance was now doomed to deteriorate in mutual suspicion and recrimination, as a German corporal of the 1st Infantry Division wrote. And at the front, the enemy are running away. French and English, equal adversaries in the World War, refuse to take us on now. In truth, our aircraft are in command of the skies. We haven't seen one enemy aircraft, only our own. Just imagine, positions like Amiens, Laon, Chemin des Dames are falling within hours. In 1418, they were fought over for years. When the Germans advanced, massacres of French and British POWs occurred, and even civilians were not spared. French West African troops were massacred by SS troops. An estimated 3,000 of them were shot out of hand after capture. On the 26th of May, the British pulled back to the French town of Dunkirk. The town was mercilessly bombed by the Germans, but that did not prevent the British from executing Operation Dynamo, the large-scale evacuation of Allied troops from mainland Europe to Britain. Its miracle lay in the calm seas and the tremendous efforts of local sailors to assist in this operation. While the Germans besieged Lille, the Allies managed to save 336,000 troops, of whom 193,000 were British and the rest French. Among these were also Polish troops in French uniform. Some 80,000 soldiers, mostly French, were left behind due to confusion and the slowness of their commanders to withdraw them. During the campaign in Belgium and northeastern France, the British lost 68,000 men. But they had still some 100,000 men in the south. Churchill sent another British expeditionary force to France under Sir Alan Brooke to keep the French in the war. The Germans wasted little time. With superiority in the sky, they moved south on the 6th of June. On the 10th of June, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain. Not prepared for war, the Italian offensive in the Alps was a failure, in which the French lost 200 men and the Italians 6,000. When Churchill met the French Allied leaders once again, he found his allies in a mood of defeatism. He flew back to London with no more illusions. On the 12th of June, Weygand discussed asking for an armistice with the French Council of Ministers. Shortly after, an abandoned Paris was captured by the Germans without a single fight. Marshal Pétain demanded an immediate armistice. Pétain would later head the French collaborationist government, Vichy France. Renault allowed him to form a new government and ask for an armistice. De Gaulle made his way to London and would play a vital role in continuing the French fight against the Axis. The French had suffered 92,000 killed and 200,000 wounded. Nearly 2 million men were rounded up as prisoners of war. Remaining British troops were evacuated from different places on the coast, for example, Saint-Nazaire in Brittany. Despite the Germans bombing a ship and killing probably over 3,500 men, another 191,000 Allied troops returned to England in this second evacuation. Hitler insisted on an exact replay of the armistice of November 1918, and the next newsreel culminated with the acceptance of German terms in the same railway carriage in the forest clearing at Compiègne. Afterwards, in a classic compensatory gesture, the carriage was brought to Berlin and exhibited at the foot of the steps of the Museum of Antiquities. The armistice went into effect on the 25th of June 1940. What the Germans didn't manage to do in 1914, they did manage to do in 1940. The Germans had won, the French had lost, and the British, they lived on to fight another day. Thanks to my patrons, you see their names on the screen, and a special thanks to Rainy Bechtel, Thomas Sapiega, Damian Wallace, Connor, Marcus Kaas, Nick Terranova, Mark Littlehill, Justin Trebell, Tanya Dixie, Susanna Di Bella, Fabrizio, Robert Meehan, David H. Ovett, Wayback History, Michael Prusi, Daniel Holland and Marcus Fielding. If you want to learn about the German invasions of the Netherlands and Belgium, click here and here for just that. You can support me via Patreon, via PayPal, or you can buy me a coffee. You can do that. Thanks for watching. See you later.